Okay. Good evening. I would like to welcome everybody to the City of Pinole Planning Commission regular meeting on Monday, February 22nd, 2021. And due to the state of California's declarations of emergency, this meeting is being held pursuant to the authorization from Governor Newsom's executive orders. City Council and Commission meetings are no longer open to in-person attendance. If you have any comments, public comments to the Planning Commission, either on citizens to be heard or on any of the agenda items, please email them to dhanham@ci.pinole.ca.us. Again, that's dhanham@ci.pinole.ca.us. You'll see that if that's too much to remember, that email address will be displayed later in the meeting. So can we do the Pledge of Allegiance, everyone? So I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic
for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Hannum, can we have a roll call, please?
Yes, Commissioner Benzili.
Present.
Commissioner Moriarty.
Present.
Commissioner Wong. Absent right now.
I'm sorry, David. I was late. I just joined.
Oh, no problem. Okay, good. You're here. Vice Chair Flashman.
Present.
Chair Curran.
Here.
Let the record show that we have 5 commissioners tonight. We can take action on all the items on this agenda. So, we're ready to move.
Thank you. Okay, then we'll go to agenda item letter C, citizens to be heard. The public may address the Planning Commission on items that are within its jurisdiction and not otherwise listed on the agenda. Planning commissioners may discuss the matter brought to their attention, but by state law, the Ralph M. Brown Act, action must be deferred to a future meeting. Time allowed is 5 minutes each. And again, if you have any comments, you can address them. The email address is displaying on the screen at dhanham@ci.pinole.ca.us. And if you have any comments, get them in. Mr. Hannum, do we have anybody who wants to speak?
Yes, we have one comment. The comment states, to all City of Pinole Planning Commissioners, Planning Manager, City Manager, Mayor, Council Member, Staff, and Pinole citizens, can you please address, reply, and respond to the following issues, problems that face our city? 1, what is the current status on repairing the major Pinole Creek Bank hillside breach side at 1400 Pinole Valley Road, adjacent to the Sprouts Gateway Shopping Center parking lot and creek trail that has had a temporary tarp cover on it over the last 2 years and still is subject to more erosion with the several past and current and future rainstorms that will result in a major slide and damage to our creeks, hillsides, trail, and the Sprouts Shopping Center parking lot. We have called both the city and the county storm flood control district on this problem several times over the last 2 years without any response for a defined plan for permanent repair fixed to the serious breach erosion problem. Number 2, why did the city allow the new Scott Lee eye surgery building to be painted a stark white, as well as the totem pole-like shrubbery trees that are a standout and as ugly eyesore and don't fit in with the surrounding buildings and landscape? Sincerely, Jim, neighbors, friends, and concerned citizens of Pinole.
Okay. Those are topics that we regularly bring up in the Planning Commission meeting. I don't know if we should, I guess we can address them later in the meeting, because I'm sure that those questions are going to be asked at the, or similar questions are going to be asked at the, when it's time for the commissioners to talk. But do you have any comments to make about that at this point, Dave, or should we hold off until the commissioners meeting? Commissioners reports.
I mean, the quick answer number 1 is I'm not sure. That's a public works issue. I'd have to follow up with our director on that to see where we're at on those. And then the second one, I've got a report on that on the later in the meeting. But just in general, I'm working with Dr. Lee right now on redoing some of that. So that's kind of, and I'll report more in detail on that later, because that was part of my, I'm sure it's going to be a question, and I wanted to update the commission on where we were at with that. So.
Yeah, I know that that's the appropriate time to do that because it is already agendized.
Right.
Okay. And those are good. I just want to say those are good points too. You know, that these are things that the Planning Commission has been wrestling with too.
Right.
Are there any other emails?
At this point, we don't have any other additional comments.
Okay. And
just a quick question. I'm sorry. Who was it that submitted that email again?
Jim and the neighbors and friends, concerned citizens of Pinole.
So not a last name on the Jim?
No.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. Next item on the agenda, since there's no more citizens to be heard, will be D, the meeting minutes, the Planning Commission meeting minutes of January 25th, 2021. Any comments on those? If nobody has any comments, does anybody want to make a motion for approval?
I'm sorry, I did just have one comment.
Okay.
First of all, with the meetings, thank you very much for attaching the emails and the contact there. That makes a big difference. Being able to read that instead of trying to remember what was read into the minutes. The second thing is, and you can advise me when it would be appropriate to ask, because I know that this is just the consent. So I wanted to confirm that we had responded to Ms. Jessica Delgado on just her second point. So I'm not sure when we should address that, and I can take it to that point when we do.
Well, this is an item on the agenda, so it's not a consent item, so we can go ahead and talk about it. I was responding to Ms. Delgado through my email, so I responded to all of her comments as the meeting was kind of going on, because I would have had to do that the next day anyway, based on when they were. So I responded to Ms. Delgado from my computer.
Okay, great. So she got the link to the existing agenda, items, and she got where she could find the site plan and everything. Yeah,
we actually forwarded her the site plan because that was for Pinole Square. I think she was looking for. The next day we forwarded her the plans, the conditions of approval, the final COA. So we were able to get her everything she needed.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Any other comments, or will somebody please make a recommendation to approve with a second?
I move that this is Commissioner Moriarty. I move that we approve the minutes of the regular Pinole Planning Commission meeting of January 25th, 2021, as was amended.
Okay, is there a second for that?
Yeah, Commissioner Bensoulier, second that.
Thank you, Adam. Okay, we got a motion on all that are in favor, say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposition? Any abstentions? Okay, so I guess it passes 5-0. All right. Then we'll move on to public hearings. I want to, at the beginning of an item, let's see, do we have any public hearings? So we do have a public hearing. I wasn't sure how it was classified. The agenda item was classified. So at the beginning of an item, the chair will read the description of that item as stated on the agenda. The city staff will then give a brief presentation of the proposed project. The commission then may ask staff questions about the item. For those items listed as public hearings, the chair will open the public hearing and ask the applicant if they wish to make a presentation. Those persons in favor of the project will then be given an opportunity to speak, followed by those who are opposed to the project. The applicant will then be given an opportunity for rebuttal. The public hearing will then be closed and the commission may discuss the item amongst themselves and ask questions of staff. The commission will then vote to approve, deny, approve in a modified form, or continue the matter to a later date for a decision. The chair will announce the commissioner's decision and advise the audience of the appeal procedure. And note, no public hearings will begin at 11 p.m. Items will remaining on the agenda after 11 p.m. will then be held over to the next meeting. The first hearing is one zoning code text amendment added chapter 17.28 historic preservation overlay to the municipal code and adopting Old Town Design Guidelines ZCA 21-01. The request, consideration of a zoning ordinance text amendment for creating a historic preservation overlay HPO district. The district will define the areas of the city in Pinole that have historic significance. The ordinance will create standards of development within borders as described in Exhibit A of the Old Town Design Guidelines, as well as properties that may be subsequently added to the HPO district. The applicant is the city of Pinole, 2131 Pear Street, Pinole, California, 94564. And the location is Old Town Pinole as defined in the Old Town Design Guidelines and applicable citywide. And the planner is Alex Moog. And I believe before we turn this over to staff, I think there are several members of the commissioners who do live in the area we're talking about. And I think that the protocol has been that we would recuse them. Is that correct?
Oh, I'm not on mute anymore. Sorry. Yes, Chair. Commissioner Moriarty and Commissioner Flashman both have live within the proposed overlay zone, and so they have potential conflict of interest because there are currently only 5 members of the commission. Because if both of them were forced to recuse themselves, we wouldn't have a quorum. And so the FPPC regulations say that one of them should be selected randomly to participate. And that selection wrote notes on a post-it and put them in the bowl before the last meeting. And Commissioner Moriarty's name was the one that was drawn out of the bowl. The meeting can be, and we'll have the meeting, so Commissioner Moriarty can participate. Commissioner Flashman cannot participate in the first part of the meeting. What we're able to do, unfortunately, we couldn't do it for the whole ordinance, the whole item, but once we talk about the ordinance and the commission makes a decision regarding the ordinance, before we talk about the design guidelines, once that first step is dealt with, then Commissioner Flashman will be able to come back and participate as a member of the commission regarding that second issue, regarding the, design guidelines, once the decision regarding the ordinance and whether or not to create this zone has been decided by the commission.
Thank you, Alex. And I will remind the community that this item was on last month's agenda, but because of our reduced number of commissioners, we were not able to have a quorum after the elimination of after recusals to be able to look at this issue. So this is a carryover from the January meeting. Okay. All right. With that, Sarah, I guess you're sitting. Is it Sarah? I guess you can go watch Jeopardy now, I guess, and for a while. And don't tell me what the final question was, please.
Do you guys do I need to go off of the?
No, you don't. As long as you don't, as long as you don't communicate to anybody, I mean, when we're meeting in a chamber, the rule is that you have to leave the room because of the fact that you could be given hand signals or whatever. But I think if you just limit your video, and Alex, you can correct me.
I think if you just put yourself on mute and turn your camera off, that's sufficient.
Yeah,
Will do.
we can watch it on TV instead of Jeopardy, But anyways, yes, you're more than welcome. Okay, with that, I'll turn it over to Alex to give a presentation.
Thank you, Chair. Next slide, please, Dave. Thank you. I guess can you one more slide, Dave, forward? Yeah. I guess these are in a weird order I didn't think about, but just as some background, the City Council at this time it's probably almost a year ago. I think it was during an in-person meeting, discussed that they want a future agenda item to discuss issues related to historic preservation in the city, and what those what were options for dealing with historic preservation. And they sent the item to the Municipal Code Update Subcommittee to review the issue, to discuss possible options, and to come up with recommendation for the City Council's consideration. So, Dave, if you could actually go back one slide. I think I put the slides in the right order the first time around. So just to go over some of the general plan policies before we dive into the ordinance. Both the general plan and the 3-quarter specific plan have a good amount of policies, goals, action items that are related to historic preservation, and some of those are listed in the staff report. To a goal of maintaining Pinole's unique character and its sense of place, and preserving the historic and small town character of the city. So that's something that the city's always valued. It's in its sort of main organizational documents. And there's a lot of policies to further that, but over time, things have slipped through the cracks. There hasn't been things on the books necessary to protect, that the city could use to enforce sort of preservation mindset. And part of why that is because the municipal code, the general plan actually only identifies 3 properties as historic. So the city had no way to enforce any sort of historic guidelines because there was only 3 places identified as historic, and that those are the Faria House, the Fernandez House. Excuse me, not the Faria House. The Fernandez House, the Bank of Pinole, and then the Downer Home are the 3 that are identified as historic, and 2 of those are on the National Register of Historic Places. And one of them is not. And the general plan also refers sort of very vaguely to the Pinole waterfront as historic, without sort of saying where that is or what that is. So there's been a desire for historic preservation, I think, through many in the community, and certainly reflected in the general plan, to preserve Pinole's history and the things that make it special. In some of the architectural features, especially, obviously in the Pinole town area. But the city hasn't had sort of an ordinance on the book to really put teeth into those goals. And in the general plan, along with these goals, really does anticipate some of the follow-up action items are an adoption of some sort of historic preservation ordinance. And for whatever reason, that had never happened. That hasn't happened. So next slide, Dave. Thank you. So the subcommittee met multiple times, 3 times, to discuss what it was looking for and what were various options. And there was a range of things considered. At one end there was a thought of, well, maybe what we just need are some plaques and informational material. No strict requirements, but just sort of to educate people. People who walk by some of these historic places may not know what they are or what the history about them is. And so that was one idea. Another, sort of on the other side of the extreme, is, well, we should do a historic preservation ordinance, like a landmarks preservation ordinance that some cities have. And the way those work is generally there's a historic survey done by a professional, and a list of historic properties is identified, and no changes are allowed to those properties unless it goes through a rigid process. But the commission the subcommittee, didn't really like the idea because, one, it can be expensive and time consuming to, you have to hire someone to do this. And it really adopts and enforces strict requirements. And what the subcommittee thought is that, well, right now, a lot of things just happen without anyone really knowing they're happening to historic structures, without the owners, in some cases, knowing that they're historic or part of a historic community. If you live in certain residences in the Old Town area, it might not look that special, for lack of a better word, if you're just looking at it by itself. And so you may not even know that this is, representative of, a certain type of historic work or broader, community effort. And so eventually what the commission decided on was this ordinance that we're going to talk about tonight. What the subcommittee decided on was this ordinance we're going to talk about tonight. And they reviewed it once or twice, went through it, and then recommended it move forward first to the planning commission as a zoning ordinance, and then to the city council for approval. And they also recommended, as we'll talk about later, that these design guidelines sort of be reviewed and re-updated. So next slide, Dave. Thanks. So what this ordinance does is it creates a historic preservation overlay zone. An overlay zone is a type of supplemental zoning that establishes regulations over and above what the normal zoning allows for. It doesn't change the underlying zoning, but it creates sort of special restrictions. So some of you who've been on the commission may remember or may be aware that the city has a high residential density overlay zone that basically says, well, any development that happens on these properties has to meet a minimum density requirement, residential density requirement. It doesn't change the underlying use, doesn't change the underlying proposals, but it has that sort of overlay on it. So sort of just an additional requirement. And that's what an overlay does. And that's what this overlay would do, but add special historic preservation additional requirements. The overlay does not create a landmark status. So simply by being in the overlay does not make a building, considered to be historic or landmark. And that's important in part, for many reasons, but in part just CEQA sort of sometimes has requirements for studying impacts on historic buildings, and this doesn't impact that at all. But what this ordinance does do, next slide, please, Dave. Thanks, is create a mechanism to make sure that projects within this overlay get an extra eye, get some extra review, just to make sure that anything about the project isn't going to impact any historic resource. So the first thing is the ordinance will create an overlay zone. The overlay zone takes the current map of Old Town Pinole that we'll look at in a minute, and makes that where the overlay is. Future properties can be added if the council determines that, and there's a process in the ordinance for doing that. Basically, the city council or the planning commission could initiate the process, just like any zoning change, to add a property to the overlay. It doesn't have to be contiguous to the overlay. It could be, so if, in Pinole Valley, there's a historic structure or place out there, we could just add that one parcel to the overlay. We don't have to spread the overlay all the way out there. But for right now, the starting point is just the, unless the commission can of course make other suggestions, but it's just sort of what is traditionally thought of as Old Town. So next slide, Dave. So this is the map of where the Old Town overlay would be, the area outlined in black. And this comes from the existing Old Town design guidelines. It has this map, and in the subcommittee thought it was accurate and there was no reason really to change it. I always get a little confused by this map. I feel like it's oriented a little weirdly, or just I think about San Pablo as running sort of directly a straight line, so it always confuses me. But so the yellow line is San Pablo, the orange line is Tenet, and then a little bit of it as Pinole Valley, and then the red is Pinole Valley. And you can see right there, Collins. The Collins School is sort of a nice, big, easy to identify area. So this is the general area of where the overlay would be within that black outline. One thing for the commission to consider is whether or not sort of the gateway sites, where Sprouts is, where Kaiser is, whether those should be included or not. At the time, the overlay, the historic preservation guidelines were adopted, those, were not developed areas like they are now. Now they're developed in a certain way. The commission may not feel like they're, need to be consistent with the rest of the more traditional Old Town area, or it's fine to consider, to keep them as is and keep it as part of that area. So next slide, Dave. So assuming the, overlay is adopted, how the overlay will work is when any project is adopted or proposed in the overlay. So that could be, tearing down a building and building a new structure. It could be doing an addition in the back, onto a home. It could be, someone wanting to add a sign on top of their building. It could be, someone wanting to build an ADU in the backyard. Before it goes through the design review process, the planning manager the zoning administrator, would look at the project and make a determination whether or not the proposed project would have an impact on a cultural resource. And the ordinance defines what a cultural resource is, and it is basically any sort of structure or building with a historic, cultural, architectural, or aesthetic significance. So this could be a beautiful old building that was built in 1870. It could be a really great example of a certain type of architectural style from the 70s, and maybe it's the only one left in Pinole. It could also be just a normal run-of-the-mill house, but it happens to be where, some historic person lived or some historic event took place that we may want to preserve. And importantly, the impact could be on, most likely, the typical situation, would be that a project has an impact on a cultural resource that's on the same property as the proposed project, right? The classic example being it's a one-story building, you want to build a second-story addition or some sort of addition. That's going to make the building look could make the building look weird or impact the aesthetic quality of the building. But it doesn't necessarily have to be a project on, the impact doesn't necessarily have to be felt on that property. It could be, there's a historic one-story building next door, and building a 30-story, not 30-story, a 3-story building right next door, right up against the property line. That just is, it's going to create shadows. It's going to change the aesthetic of, this block, this area. So it doesn't have to, the impact on a cultural resource doesn't have to be right on the same property as the proposed project. Next slide. So first, that decision is appealable. Whether or not it'll impact a cultural resource, that can be appealed. And like all zoning administrative decisions, that gets appealed to the planning commission. And if someone doesn't like the planning commission's decision, it could be appealed to the city council. But regardless of whether it's appealed or not, if the project would impact a cultural resource, the project is required to comply with special design guidelines. And those special design guidelines are the historic preservation guidelines we're going to talk about in a little bit. And the guidelines are applied through the otherwise applicable design review process. So as the commission knows, we have administrative design review that just, for small projects, generally, for example, additions under 500 square feet, reviewed by the zoning administrator, whereas other projects, most commercial projects, new single-family homes, those are subject to comprehensive design review, which goes to the planning commission. And then whichever one it goes through, the design guidelines, the historic preservation design guidelines would be applied during that process. So the Old Town design guidelines, I mentioned a few times already that they're existing. They're already on the books. They were in fact adopted, 23 years ago, or more than that at this point, in 1997. But for whatever reason, they, it's not clear to us whether they were maybe applied the first few years, but certainly in the last few years, last 10 years, they sort of haven't been applied at all. Staff really wasn't aware of them. Part of that issue, I think, may have been that by their own terms, they're not mandatory. It uses a lot of, we should apply them. These are recommendations. I just zoomed way out, but hold on one second while I zoom back in so I can see what I'm looking at. Sorry about that. But, essentially, so for example, one of the things the ordinance, the design guidelines say is, to quote directly, the design guidelines which follow are to be used as an advisory tool. Compliance with these guidelines is strongly encouraged. So I don't know for sure, but you can imagine a situation where, the first few years, after they were adopted, staff who would, work with developers or whoever with these projects. But if there's not a ton of projects coming in this area, over time, people can forget about it, or especially if there's not much teeth behind them and, an applicant sort of chooses to ignore it and there's not a ton you can do about it, that over time they might have fallen out of use. So what this ordinance does is makes it mandatory for projects within within the historic preservation overlay. If they impact the cultural resources, they have to comply with these design guidelines. And the design guidelines, as you see, they're not overly strict. They don't say, you have to paint you can only use these 3 colors. They're pretty flexible still, but projects will have to comply with them within the overlay zone. And it'll ultimately, a project that comes before the planning commission it will ultimately be up to the Planning Commission to determine whether or not the project complies with these design review guidelines. So we'll have an opportunity to talk about the design review guidelines in more depth later in the meeting, because we're trying to segment this into two issues. But for now, the focus is just on the historic preservation overlay itself, whether the commission has any questions about it, ideas, suggestions, issues with the map of the overlay itself or the process. I'm happy to answer questions or take feedback. We can always incorporate those into the recommendation that is made to the city council. And I believe, Dave, if you can go to the next slide. Yeah. So at this point, what we're recommending is that the Planning Commission recommend approval to the city council of an ordinance adding chapter 17.28 historic preservation overlay to the municipal code. So that was a lot of information, and I jumped around a little bit there. So I'm happy to answer any question that commission may have about any part of this overlay.
Thank you, Alex. And just for the audience out there, there was a handout that had the Old Town Design Guidelines, which is quite detailed. And I don't think we're planning on going through this thing by page. So I hope that those on the outside community had an opportunity to review the guidelines. Right now, we're talking about questions from the commissioners to the staff. So I'll start off with Adam.
So is this just a vote on the overlay, the map itself, or the design guidelines?
It would just be on the map itself in the text of the ordinance, which is sort of lays out the process for how that overlay would work, but not the design guidelines themselves. Okay.
As far as what about the actual process about defining whether this is part of, the historic aspect of it, like if it's a cultural resource or not? Is that part of this?
Yeah, that discussing that now is part of this. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm curious, how is the cultural part determined? I know they talked about, there's several criteria. I think it was, the cultural resource definition.
Yeah.
Is there like a checklist, or is there some sort of? It could be seen as fairly subjective, especially like if the site is identified with a person of significance or not. I mean, that can mean different things to different people who they,
So the zoning, and that's an excellent point. The way it's set up is that right now it's the zoning administrator that makes that determination. His or her determination can be appealed to the Planning Commission, but they make the initial determination. So, they get a project. If they're in, big thing what this does is they'll get a project and they'll know this is within the overlay zone. I need to look into this or double check, and, they can look at the project and see, this is a building that was built, 10 years ago. I know this isn't a cultural resource. I know that the buildings around it aren't cultural resources. It just happens to be in this area. So it's up to the zoning administrator to make that first determination. Like any zoning administrative determination, they have the right to always refer it to the Planning Commission to make that decision. So if it's something they're not 100% sure of, or just think it'll be, controversial, or someone's going to appeal their decision anyway, they can always just refer it to the Planning Commission directly to make that determination. But you are right, it is subjective in some ways. There's no this sort of work is always, this type of historic preservation ordinances are always subjective at some point making that determination. And the subcommittee thought this was just the best way because it was still sort of informal, but made sure that a project didn't get approved without someone at least sort of thinking about it.
And also when these projects come in, I mean, since the zoning administrator come out of my office or me, as a matter of fact. So, I mean, I would have to take a look at, when the building was built, I'd have to actually go out. Usually you have to go out and take a look around the site. I mean, Googling that doesn't work. You got to really go out there and see what's on hand. So a site visit I would require a site visit to go out there to take a look at it. And then just examine the lists of any buildings, and might be on a list that we don't know about. So we can check the state and the county and the city list just to make sure that it's not on a list. And at that point, then I would move forward with the determination of what that building was.
Thank you. But as far as the history of the site, would you go back through deeds and who's owned the site and the history of the site from when it was first developed, or is that?
I mean, we could. I mean, if we check our building records to see when the building first. If it wasn't, we could. I mean, we could do a deed search. I mean, I wouldn't make that decision unless once I went out and saw the building, and then I said, I probably need to see when and we need a deed train or something of that nature.
And I would just add that that particular option was just included sort of for something, and maybe something will happen in the future. I'm not aware, and I think it wouldn't be normal to expect the zoning administrator or Dave to do a title search for everything. If it's not sort of known in the community that some historic person lived there or historic event took place there, it probably is not something that's going to be known. But who knows, in 20 years from now, 15 years from now, maybe a plain house where a current council member lives, maybe there'll be the governor will want to, or the president will want to say, hey, that's historic. Or some kid in Pinole Valley High who we don't even know their name yet. So that was sort of the idea, just to include that in case it's pretty common for these types of ordinances, but not an expectation that there'll be some sort of deep historic research going on for each one.
Okay, cool, thank you. And as far as the map, can you bring the map back up? Because I had a question on whether the set of properties, I guess it's northeast of Pinole Tenant, just west of, I think it's technically the railroad tracks, I guess. Whether the black lines kind of, say where it is. Yes, it's between the two railroad track areas. Whether that black line encapsulates the properties kind of north of the first set of properties, or kind of it just limits the first set of properties. There's two black lines that kind of hit them with in or out.
So one of those is, I believe, it's not clear on that map, but it's the street. What there? Oh, I see what you're talking about. North of there.
Yeah.
I think it. Well, I had always assumed that it was the farther north one that ran sort of almost at the border. Maybe one house in that other line near the Tenant Ave is that black line was more the street boundary, but it's it's up to the commission to decide whether you want to include those homes over in that area within it or not. Before this goes to the city council, we will be making sort of more of a formal overlay map, like what you would see on the zoning map. And so based on what the commission decides, we can adjust the map accordingly.
And so the last comment I have is on the Gateway shopping area. Even though I know those properties have been fairly well developed at this point, I think they're still important even if they're just applied so that new developments match the current developments that are there, and the coloring and all that stuff. I think it's still important to keep those properties in that overlay, even though the historicness of it will be recent, but there's still some consistency in that area.
Well, Adam, I think we're going to be, right now we're asking questions for staff. I appreciate your comment, but I think that's probably more appropriate when we're deliberating on this about boundaries. But I think there's a lot of questions about the boundaries that are in our minds about whether they're appropriate or not.
Cool. Sorry. Cool. All right. I love that. No, I have no further questions.
Thank you. Simon.
Thank you, Chair. Hey, Alex, I have kind of related questions that coming from Adam anyway. So, I want to know a little bit better about the process of adding, because right now what we're trying to say is the HPO zone, it's literally kind of currently on a map, like copying the Old Town map. And you did mention in your presentation saying that it is, up to the recommendations from the planning commissions and get approval by the city council that we can add properties in it, right? So immediately, and you raised that question actually really well. You're reading my mind already. That hey, who knows? 10 years from now, that someone at some locations might end up being the historic preservation area that we want to add to it. But you also mentioned on the presentations that right now to add this and then later on talking about the Old Town guidelines, right?
Yeah.
So what if that building is not within the Old Town guidelines?
So if the area in the future is not within Old Town, it would still have to, it was decided that it should be added to this overlay. It would still be subject to those Old Town design guidelines at the time that it went forward with the a project. If it had been added to the overlay and then subsequent to that had a project, it would be subject to the Old Town design guidelines. Because of that possibility, there was some discussion about whether or not to change the name of the Old Town design guidelines to just sort of historic preservation guidelines.
That's good.
For simplicity, we didn't do that right now, but that, I thought it would cause some confusion, but we could build that into the recommendation for the city council that, that's name these simply historic preservation guidelines.
Yeah, you're reading my mind already. Thank you, Alex, because I was thinking about that. And I was thinking also sometimes historic preservation can be, sometimes very subjective, So, my understanding of the Old Town guidelines, sometimes it's, really related to the, what we call the older building, and so, it will be a little bit difficult to, think about applying some of those in other locations. So that becomes something. So, but that is not really focusing on this particular one. I'm very appreciative about this. This is the only questions I have. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you, Simon. Anne, do you have any questions for the staff?
Yeah, just a couple. First of all, are the Old Town design guidelines now online? Are they there now?
Last I thought they should be. If they're not, they should be. So I will take a look right now.
Okay.
While he's checking, who is the zoning administrator? Is that the planning manager?
That would be me.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, great. That's good. And just as a matter of record, who was on this subcommittee?
It was Mayor Martinez Rubin and Councilmember Murray, or former Councilmember Murray. At the time they were reviewing this, he was on the council.
Pete Murray.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So Norma, Pete, and Alex, you.
Yeah, and Dave was there, and Tamara was there at times too, providing feedback and impact, and
okay.
I think Andrew attended one of the meetings as well.
But to follow up on that question, who was on the original 1997 when this was developed?
That I do not have the answer for.
All right. So Kayla, just in thinking about the process, when I was trying to go through this, basically thinking, let me see if I can summarize for myself and if this makes sense. So if if a property is in the Historic Preservation Overlay District, then it will receive enhanced design review. If the zoning administrator determines that there are cultural resources on the property, then that property or project will be subject to the Old Town Design Guidelines. Okay. And then if there are no cultural, if the zoning administrator determines that there are no cultural resources, even if it's in the Historic Preservation Overlay District, then they are encouraged to comply with the Old Town Design Guidelines, but not held mandatory.
Correct. I would say the one slight caveat I would say is the cultural resource doesn't have to necessarily be on the parcel where the project is proposed. So, if it's right next to a cultural resource,
right,
it might have to comply. But yeah.
Good. Okay. So I guess one of my questions is so we're dealing with within a neighborhood, say, for instance, in the neighborhood that I live in, there's probably not any house in and of itself that is a cultural resource, but it's because a house is part of a whole, it's part of a neighborhood, that whatever happened to that house would affect, the look and the feel of the entire neighborhood. Mm-hmm. So my only question there is, I see language in the design guidelines regarding neighborhoods, but not in the overlay in the ordinance.
Yeah. So the definition of cultural resource in the overlay ordinance does mention that it could, it just could be something that contributes to the significance of, a historic area.
Okay.
That, has, just to read, it's a definable area possessing, a concentration of historic or scenic properties, or thematically related grouping of properties or properties which contribute to each other and are unified aesthetically by plan or physical development. So, which maybe it's not as explicit as the design guidelines, but it sort of anticipates, if there's a grouping of homes that maybe by themselves aren't anything special, but they're a grouping of a couple of cottages and, they add something.
Okay, where did you read that?
That's in section 17.28.020, which is cultural resources definition in its subpart B.
Got it. Okay, good. All right, good.
And I will say just, this isn't something for the commission, that, there is this step in here where now it creates, someone's got to decide if there's cultural resource or not. The planning commission could recommend to the city council, let's take that out. Let's just say everything in the historic preservation overlay has to comply with the design guidelines. That's up to the commission. That wasn't what the subcommittee wanted to do, but I think there's the full council, and I think the subcommittee even would be open to additional feedback.
Okay, that's excellent. Thank you for pointing, because there was just in your analysis and report, there was a definition of the cultural is something of cultural significance and cultural resource, and I skimmed over it in the actual language, and that's much stronger language. So I appreciate that. Okay, and then then another process question: if the zoning administrator says that a project does not have anything of cultural significance, can the planning commission appeal that?
Under the city's rules, they can. I believe, well, I guess the answer I believe is, I can double check. I believe the answer is no. Any member of the planning commission could appeal it, but they would have to pay the appeal fee.
So the zoning administrator has all of the power to make the decision then, is what you're saying?
The initial decision.
Well, someone can appeal it, or the zoning administrator could, refer it to the commission to act.
Okay.
Let me just.
That's to me. I mean, no offense to you, David, Hannah, but that to me is a little bit scary that it's just one person who makes that decision, and if the planning commission were to feel differently, say for instance, we had a planning manager who was just, not into any kind of historic preservation whatsoever, and was into modernizing everything and could make decisions that the planning commission and the citizens would not agree with. Obviously, that's not David Hannum at this point, but hypothetically, that could happen. So that's a concern I have about the process.
And so I just checked our code, and the code says that a city council member can appeal a planning commission decision, but there is not similar language saying planning commission member could appeal the zoning administrator's decision. You certainly could, in your capacity as a private citizen, submit an appeal, but then you got to pay a fee and all of that.
Well, Alex, I have a question.
Yeah,
I'll shoot this question out. Is that what if decisions made by me and the design review board? Because the planning commission does have a planning design review board that's made up of 3 commissioners?
Yeah, so I certainly think that the design review board is for projects that go to the planning commission. So if it doesn't go to the planning commission, it doesn't go to that design review board. I think you as planning commission, as zoning administrator, could certainly confer with those people. But I think Commissioner Moriarty's concern is, what if there's, in the future, someone else who doesn't want to confer with the design review board or the planning commission in general, and that is not something that's addressed by the ordinance. We could add language to that effect, saying, the planning commission will notify the city council, the planning commission.
The reason why I'm asking that is because if the zoning administrator, what if the zoning administrator automatically refers it to the zoning review board?
Or it could
design review board.
Yeah. We're kind of getting into discussion here. I think this is a good point, but I think also it could go as a consent item. We never used a consent item on the agendas. Maybe this would be a good thing where any approval by the planning manager has to be approved by the planning commission on the as the consent calendar or something like that. But this is something that would be really good to discuss when we bring it up to the ordinance, to designing the ordinance.
Okay.
I think you've identified a weakness in the ordinance that needs to be discussed later.
Okay. All right. Whenever it is then that we discuss that. Those are my only questions. So
sure.
Great.
Yeah, and just going on that line, we've been kind of discussing about individual properties. Like right now we have the, it's overlaid. It just, nobody ever, we thought about exclusion rather than inclusion of other properties. But, Pinole's got some rich history that I don't think is recognized. We got a a Heisman Trophy winner that came from Pinole. We have a Rock and Roll Hall of Fame band that developed in Pinole, and maybe we need to designate their homes or where these, as historic significance, and I'm not exactly sure what the process to go about that is, but I think those are, we don't have to wait for a future historic person. Pinole's already produced some historic people, but one other question I have concerns on page 37 of the handout that we got. It's about ADUs, about accessory dwelling units, accessory building design. I guess accessory buildings should be compatible with the main residential structure. They should be secondary of importance to the primary structure. Given how the planning commissions around the state have been kind of had their wings clipped as far as design review of ADUs, is it something that we can include in this ordinance where we can have the accessory buildings being compatible with the main resident? Is there, are we crossing the law here at all?
So we can do that for accessory buildings, but not for accessory dwelling units. And accessory dwelling units meaning residential units because of state law. So under state law, our design review for ADUs has to be ministerial, which means, basically objective. And so something that's compatible, that's not an objective standard because compatibility is, subjective. So that is not something that we would be able to enforce if it was an ADU.
Okay, that's what I feared. All right, that's all I had. Is there any other questions for staff before I open up the public hearing and bring in the public? Okay, I forgot my gavel today, so I'll have to.
Sorry, just one more question.
Okay.
With the Old Town Design Guidelines, then all the shoulds become wills.
Yeah, for the properties that, that's up to the commission and to make a recommendation as to that, that is how I interpret it when it becomes mandatory. But if the commission feels it should be something different.
Okay.
All
right.
It's still just as a comment, it's still, there's still a lot of, even if those should become shalls, there's still a lot of, some of them still provide a lot of flexibility. Doors shall be substantial and well detailed,
Well, maybe we need to come up with, clarity as far as what will, should, and shall mean.
Well, it's written, maybe we can talk about that when we get to the Old Town Design Guidelines discussion, because if there is the vocabulary is in there, but it was confusing to me as far as understanding what should means. And so when you gave the slide that the design guidelines become mandatory, what that says to me is that should becomes shall, and that it becomes a mandatory thing instead of just an encouragement.
Sure. Yes, that's something to discuss. Okay, is there anybody else have any questions for the staff? If not, I forgot my gavel today, so I'll open up the public hearing. Mr. Hannum, do we have any comments from the outside public?
No, we do not.
We do not. Okay, then I will close the public hearing and bring it back to the commissioners for discussion. Okay, we have a couple of things that we want to discuss. We want to discuss the boundaries. Maybe we should take this one at a time, rather than having everything go. So we had the boundaries of the district, the decision.
appeal process.
Decision appeal process. We had the addition of additional properties, and the will, should, shall. Any other things that we want to discuss?
I would just say that the last thing, the will, should, shall, should wait till the second discussion when Commissioner Flashman can come back when we discuss the design guidelines in depth.
Okay, we can do that. All right, so let's just get a discussion on the boundaries of this. I'm going to start off with this because I just kind of want to get the discussion flowing. And I think that the boundaries were kind of like looking at the old specific planning area of Old Town and really don't meet the desire for a historic district anymore because, we mentioned about the Gateway project. Is that still historic? I mean, it goes all the way to down Appian, not Appian, but San Pablo Avenue, well east of where anything of significance is. I just think that this boundary needs to be tightened. And I think that the idea of calling it, and I think there's properties that are outside this boundary, this overlay that could potentially be historic in value. So I think we need to really take good, serious discussion about the boundaries. What we want to call this and all that kind of stuff. So let's just focus on that item first, and I'll let's see. Let me go in reverse there. I think Ann, you were the last, so you'll be the first shall be the last, or the last shall be the first.
Last shall be first. I don't know if I have anything proactive to say. So I'm going to, I think I'll respond to other people in discussion because I'm sure there are things that I haven't thought of. So no comment.
Okay. Simon, the second last shall be the second first.
Always the middle one. So my reactions is, that I do agree that I think we should take a, closer look of the boundary. Although my other half of my brain are also telling me that because we actually did put in, the wording of being able to add, right, additional locations. And I think the language should be also saying that maybe perhaps we consider that somebody or someone can take out, some of the area in a later day, right? So that we have always the flexibility. Because I can see what the point of view from, Commissioner Benzuli is thinking, like, hey, maybe perhaps we would keep the gateway. On the other hand, well, why keeping the gateway? I mean, I can see both ways. So I guess it's with that flexibility of being able to add or to, subtract, to me, give us the flexibility so that we don't have to nail down in detail at this particular moment of what area is supposed to be. I still have questions. I know that we are not supposed to discuss this, for the so-called Old Town guideline but I've been thinking about eventually that will tie into the wording or should or whatnot here, because I'm thinking 5 years from now, Dr. Lee is going to add an additional to the building, and his building is so 21st century look like. And if his is being in the zone, then, whatever guideline that we end up approving will be applying to that. And that is not even close to what his building is going to look like right now, right? So how are we going to deal with that? So that's why I think the flexibility of being able to put in or flexibility of being able to pull out in the discussions of that particular current planning commission and get approved by the city, council, will create a flexibility for us.
Okay, so you don't think we should be changing the boundaries at all?
Well, I think we need to set up some initial boundary, and I think this is actually the best way to do it right now. I mean,
Sure.
I think the boundary right now is okay to a certain extent. Again, being able to have the flexibility of adding in or pulling out, in any time, I think that will be great. I mean, from my point of view.
Okay. All right. Any other well, I guess you made your comment. Adam, your thoughts?
Pretty similar. I don't really see any issues with the boundary as it currently stands, and I do like the flexibility you can add in and just subtract properties out as needed in the future, even if it's on an isolated or kind of island basis. But I don't really, except for that clarification I had about where it was, the black line was on the map, kind of right between the railroad tracks. I didn't really have any specific comments other than that on the boundary. I think it's fine as it stands.
Okay. Yeah, and and part of the discussion about the boundaries is sort of the name too. Do we want to call it the Old Town Historic Overlay District, or do we just want to call it just the Historic Overlay District? Because possible, because we may want to include other areas around Pinole that are not inclusive of the boundary. So that's part of the discussion too. So except for, wanting to clarify that little black area, those black lines that are kind of like around, I don't know, Pinole's all twisted. I agree with I forget who said it about how things are kind of twisted around in Pinole, because I still to this day, even though I've lived in the city for like some 35 years, I still have trouble figuring out where east and west and north and south are, because things get twisted. I mean, I have to look at the sun, but at night I'm in trouble, But I think that area that would be adjacent to where that recreational vehicle storage area is, it seems like that area is kind of like not included in the historic district. I think we need to have a discussion on that. Okay. Any other comments, Adam?
No.
Yeah.
Sorry. This is like a quick question. Can the name, more of a question for Alex, I think, if it's called one thing versus another thing, whether it's the Old Town Design Guidelines or just historic guideline, like, whether they probably not be challenged legally? Like if someone says, "Well, I'm not really part of the Old Town and I'm way out here,"
no, I don't.
It doesn't apply to me.
That doesn't. Someone could always challenge their inclusion, but the fact that the name, a specific name, wouldn't be a very strong basis to challenge it.
Yeah, we could call it Old Town and Historic Design Guidelines, and that way we kind of still preserve the idea that Old Town is a separate entity in itself in the city, and that there are other areas that can be historic too. I kind of like that idea.
Yeah, through the chair, I actually kind of not thinking about it. I mean, it's opposite to this particular idea. I think historic preservation overlay should be a standalone thing that can apply to any locations of the city, whether or not they are in Old Town or not. We just happen to pick the Old Town locations as our start. So I don't think we should attach that Old Town name to it, number one. And number two, it's just like what I've been, commenting in a way that perhaps there will be other locations in the future that we are going to add into this HPO zone. And the Old Town Design Guideline might only be fit into a certain location. It doesn't have to do with other locations that we need to apply. Perhaps the city need to think about develop some other preservation guideline to fit other locations and not just, continue to think about the Old Town, right?
Yeah.
So that's what I'm thinking.
I think we might be making things a little too complicated. When we think of Pinole, and maybe I'm just thinking too narrowly, we've always thought of Old Town Pinole as being that historic district in a sense, as opposed to, the other side of the freeway, which, out the valley. So we've got districts. And Old Town is one of those districts, that we've got the 3 corridor specific plan, we've got those commercial districts, and Old Town has its own flavor, its own sense. And so I would not want to lose that designation of the Old Town part of it. And so I'd be okay with adding, and again, we're just making the suggestion to the city council, but adding Old Town and historic design or whatever. But I don't want to lose that designation of the Old Town, especially as these design guidelines themselves, even though they are general and flexible, were designed specifically for Old Town. So even like I said, though, even though they are general. So personally, I don't want to lose that name.
I think you're right on that, Ann. I think the idea that I had in flying and saying, the Old Town and historic design guidelines kind of captures everything. So
Simon, are you okay with that?
I'm fine with that.
No, I was saying Simon because he's the one who said he wanted to take out Old Town.
Well, again, I'm thinking out 10, 20 years from now when some other locations might end up being, put in as a, historic, preservation zone, right? Overlay. If we are talking about if we want to keep the Old Town and the HPO, historical preservation overlay, then that might be a alternate. That might be work out. Okay.
Okay.
I just don't want to specifically saying that the historical preservation is only for the Old Town only.
Yeah.
Because, the wording here that we are seeing or have received for the last 30 minutes has been kind of like being able to add on other stuff throughout the entire city from Pinole.
Okay.
Which the ordinance allows.
So we got 3, I guess, Adam, I guess, what are your thoughts on this? Because I think we're kind of reaching a consensus here and changing it to Old Town and historic guidelines.
Yeah, I think I'm fine with it. I think there's language in the design guidelines that talk about how things get treated individually, in conjunction with the rest of the neighborhood. So I'm good with the way it's written and keeping the Old Town name. I think it's appropriate.
Okay, so I think we've kind of reached consensus on that. We'll pass. So I think we'll make that change when it comes time to pass the resolution. Let's see. Then the next thing was the decision. What do you have? I had her. Am I writing anymore?
And just to clarify, Chair. So besides for the name, the consensus was to keep the map flow the same?
No, I don't think that's the consensus yet. Because I personally think that there are places that shouldn't be in the district and some places that are part of Old Town that are not in the district. And specifically, I am not in favor of keeping the gateway properties in the historic district because because they're not historic anymore, Similarly, I think we go down San Pablo Avenue too far, all the way to where's it go? It goes pretty much all the way to where, almost where Appian is, I think if I read this map right, it goes past Appian actually. And, the truth is that once you get past Oak Ridge, there's really nothing of historic value anymore. And similarly, I think there are some properties like on Quinnen Street and Buena Vista, which I'm not sure. I tried to get a Pinole map to really get, I kind of thought I had one, but I lost it. But I think the areas that go, that are around Quinnen and you go up to Buena Vista where you have the, that big property where I've never really been able to confirm this, but I think John Fogerty used to have a music studio up there. I've not really been able to ever confirm that or not, but I've heard rumors about that. And of course, we have that area that's on Buena Vista that goes up there where the Property Brothers built their, did their work. Those are kind of historic houses up there. And so I kind of think that we should push the boundary around Buena Vista and Quinnen out a little bit more to include that. It looks like that the property that's that's up on the top of the hill by the railroad tracks. If we could just jiggy jog that black line, to include those areas, I think that would be really beneficial. In addition, so what I'm really saying is I think we should shorten it. Cut the boundary by Henry Street to the east. If going up Pinole Valley Road and cut it by Oak Ridge going down San Pablo Avenue, and then adding that little jiggy jog around Buena Vista and the big house that's on the hill. Those are my thoughts.
Question, is it possible to punt on making the boundary decision right now and accept I'm seriously, because this map is not clear enough, obviously, with what the chair is suggesting and thinking. I mean, is it possible to okay the ordinance without having the exact boundary decided?
Well, we could punt it by making a stab at it and then letting the city council review the guidelines or the boundaries. But I think our intent here is to kind of is to really look at the history of the city and not just. I think we got trapped when these boundaries were designed by looking at the SPA for the boundaries rather than really looking at where the history is.
That's why I'm asking, Alex, if it's a deeper conversation, can we?
So we can certainly, I guess two things. One, yes, you can do, but the ordinance won't really have any impact if there's no overlay yet adopted. Because there won't be anything to say, you're within this zone. But you could certainly adopt something and expand it or change it later, or also send it to the city council and say we think you should appoint a committee or have it send it back to the planning commission to really do. Let's not do this broad zone. Let's look at houses by houses.
No.
I don't really want to look at houses by houses.
Right. That was a stretch, but I don't. But I guess to the main question is, the ordinance can be adopted, but it has no teeth unless there's an overlay it applies to.
Got it.
And that was the whole issue back in '97 was they adopted the guidelines. They just never adopted the historic overlay district to amend those guidelines.
Okay.
So I might say, this isn't. This was a similar conversation to what the subcommittee had, and they had similar thoughts of why is it going all the way down San Pablo, and then there was the Green Lantern sign. Oh, we would hate for that to be lost, or
it's history. It's Green Lantern sign's history,
right? But I think that was an example of we wouldn't want something like that. And so it was okay, that's keep it as it sort of.
Yeah, I would keep it as is. I think agreeing with that. Thinking about Norma and Peter's history also in this community, and then in the future, thinking about adding in the hill. David, like you were suggesting, or adding in other places, because the ordinance does allow that. But if we could spend an hour or 2 hours trying to make that decision right now, where we have a beginning boundary to start off with, so that we can get this enforceable, and then, you know, in the near future, with the recommendation to the city council that we maybe apply, you know, that we apply the boundary as is now, and that we have a further discussion with another subcommittee in the future.
Okay, I think I think what we're looking for is wording that our when we pass this to the city council, that we state about how we feel that the boundaries are too generous, and that we would recommend further action on reviewing the boundaries, especially with respect to including the gateway and the extension of the overlay district past Oak Ridge on San Pablo.
Well, I don't know if I would agree with you there. I mean, I know that Adam had made the suggestion about, you know, including the gateway. So I think there's further discussion there, but I don't know, you know, so I don't know if I would make it bigger or smaller, you know, at this point.
In the recommendation to the council could be, you know, we recommend you adopt this ordinance, and the commission will be further studying the overlay zone and may suggest additions or subtractions in the future, and that could be the recommendation, and then the commission, you know, on its own could just take that up and you know, decide to appoint a subcommittee or decide to do something. It doesn't have to be you know, blessed by the city council necessarily for you to make those recommendations to the city council, and then it's up to them to decide whether or not to accept them or not. Or you could also, you know, when we present this to the city council, we could see if what their feedback is, you know, because if they all think, no, we think this is perfect, you know, you may not want to, you know, spend your time doing it. If the council thinks this is perfect, we don't want to make any changes. So I just meant that as a way of, I don't know if you want the keep it for yourself or to have a plan, the city council sort of appoint a new subcommittee. I assume they would want to just have the planning commission do it rather than, you know, interview people and figure that out. But that was a rambling answer. So.
Okay. All right. And all right. I think we should just add a sentence that we can keep the boundaries as they are. You know, but there is one thing I'm kind of working on a sentence here, you know, because I still think that we should put language in either the guidelines or the resolution about you know, properties that are outside the overlay district. And so I was thinking about adding this sentence to the guidelines under 1.1 boundaries, which is on page 2. And I haven't quite wordsmithed this yet, but I just kind of want to get the idea out there that, and this is it, individual properties outside the Old Town Overlay District which have historic significance can be designated as part of this ordinance, so that we can and then that begs the question about who decides which property.
Yeah, well, so Chair, if I may, the ordinance itself, which is attached as an exhibit to the resolution, says the zoning administrator, planning commissioner, city council may initiate proceedings to add the HPO, the historic preservation zone designation to a property.
Okay, so you're satisfied. You're satisfied.
There already is a process to add, and you know, it would go, the way it would work is because it's a zoning designation, is it would come to a planning commission for a recommendation to then go to the city council.
Yeah.
For.
Okay.
And through the chair, all I'm asking is just change that language to add or subtract. I mean, again, talking about that flexibility. I think that language will actually be good enough that we do not have to go through tonight the map, because that way will give us plenty of chances in the future to discuss, agree or disagree with each others, but able to create a map. Again, back to the City Council for consideration.
Okay,
I agree.
I agree.
Yeah, me too.
So we'll add that. And the other item that we wanted to discuss was the approval process or the exclusion process. Do we just limit it to the planning manager, or do we want to put language in there that it should include the design review committee or be a consent item on the planning commission or approved by the planning commission? I think that gets to be too detailed to say. To say put it in a consent thing, but do we just want to have one person making the decisions?
To the chair, my only concern about, I share the same, concern that, Commissioner Moradi actually point out. On the other hand, again, I'm just kind of juggling in between the two, is that if we are going to be adding a design subcommittee, to kind of make that call, are we potentially delaying, the process, of, getting through the building, design done? Because, again, a lot of the complaints or kind of remember the old situation was it takes too long for Pinole to actually process my request, right? And then, now we are adding more layers to it, because now we are saying that you have to go through this guideline or the overlay. Now we are talking about not only the design manager or the planning manager is making the decisions, but now we have to schedule the subcommittee. And if we are all good enough, as a planning commissioner in the subcommittee, we will be able to schedule a time. Right now it's a perfect timing, by the way, because everybody is locked into their home. But, when everything's open up, then there will be a chance that a month or two, we won't be able to actually get together because of our work or whatever it is. So I'm just concerned about that.
Perhaps through the chair, solution would be not to make it the default, but just add language saying a planning commissioner can appeal a decision of the zoning administrator to the planning commission. And so that way, if anyone's happy, it just continues on its process. But
or we can also do something like, because usually the chair will have a lot of communications with the planning manager.
You think so?
And so my thinking is, okay, well, if one set of eyes is not enough, perhaps we can set the second set of eyes so that, in this particular situation, perhaps, the 2 days can talk and think, okay, do we want to put this building or these applications into a subcommittee for further considerations? So at least you have David, and then now you have the chair, which happens to be Dave.
So I would just say from a legal perspective, certainly the zoning administrator can consult with any number of commissioners, but there's no way to make the chair have special powers that other members don't have regarding approval or designation, that sort of thing.
So I'm sorry, Adam, were you starting to say something?
Oh, no, I was,
no,
go ahead.
Okay. I like the more of the language that you brought, Alex, that a planning commissioner can appeal it to the planning commission. So what that means then is then it automatically goes into potential design review, right? So that opens up that door. The only problem is how do we find out about it?
Well,
right?
that's all saying, that we, and this doesn't just apply. This doesn't just apply to this ordinance. It probably applies to a lot of decisions that are being made. And I guess what we may need is to have the planning director report any decisions that have been made and provide a list, and the commission can at that point in time decide to find out if there's any that they figure need to be reviewed. So
Especially any deferrals. How would the consent calendar work? How would that portion work? You mentioned that, Dave.
Well, the consent calendar is sort of like an automatic review. It's not supposed to have some discussion, but the planning commissioners are able to pull items from the consent calendar to be agendized or discussed later in the meeting. And we've kind of abused the consent calendar because he always was with the just the approval of the minutes. We always end up discussing those at length, which is why I like this idea of pulling them out. But ideally, the consent calendar is supposed to have no discussion with it, but each individual members of the commission have the ability to say, I'd like that to be pulled and discussed as a separate agenda item.
So that seems like a reasonable kind of thing. I don't know, as a planning manager because there are some things that you don't see, like a planning technician, one of the building technicians might see, say for instance, if, one of the houses, one of the Queen Anne's wanted to change their windows or something like that, and that wouldn't necessarily go to the zoning administrator. It would just be an over the counter kind of permit thing.
I'm sorry. Well, I mean, we would set up a process basically. If and when the commission and the council adopts the map, we will then highlight every single address that is within this map. So if any project comes in that has one of those addresses, it'll be tagged. They'll be tagged as a historic property, at which point then it triggers the next set of reviews. So we've already had that. Yeah, we already have. We just have to define the map and get all the addresses within that map, which we will work on once the map's approved. And it'll take us probably about 60 days to get all those addresses in. There will be, remember, I mean, we're only looking at projects that are going to review the outside of the building. So anything inside the building, whether it's a hot water heater or something over the counter that you're not going to see, I'm not going to see as a director. It's only for those projects that are remodeling the outside of the buildings.
Okay, that's great. And then if we were to, though, you know how you gave us this approved or this project list? I'm holding it in front of my face, right?
Yeah, I see.
So that if we had that it was a part of a requirement of the ordinance that every month that the list of those things that were brought up, that I don't know how it works. You can help us flesh that out.
The problem is going to be this: is that the problem will be that if a project comes in, okay, and let's say it's a house on John Street, and they want to they want to review all their windows, okay. At this point, the way the ordinance reads right now, it gets flagged. It's on John Street. It comes to me. At this point, I'm saying, it's not changing this. It's not changing the heart of the building. It looks like it's okay. Boom, it's gone, right? I've reviewed it. I've signed off on it, and it goes. Well, unless that project has additional reviews by other areas, then that project's going to get a permit and it's going to go build. Okay. So what we're going to have to, any process that we add for this area I don't care what you say, it will slow down projects in the area because it has to go through a review from me. And if I decide that, at least at this point, this is a big one, I'll take it to the commission, then it's going to add additional time to it. So there's no way that I can, it's going to be very difficult to add like you see it a month later. I mean, I could review this thing in January 1st. You don't get it until January 22nd, and that project's already gone. They're already starting construction. So we would have to then red tag it, stop it. And
I guess I agree with David's point that there would be delays, right? Like, because we would have to just not issue, the building permit just couldn't be issued until the planning commission had its review. And so it would cause long delays because, David would have to tell them, well, this looks good, but can't get you on the planning commission agenda for a month.
Also, there is a process for the zoning administrator. There is a zoning administrator process to have meetings and scheduled meetings and all that kind of stuff, which I could do with these particular projects that I could do.
I think the argument against that, David, is that can do and will do are two different words. And
what I'm saying is that there is a, in the code, in our Muni code, there is a section in our Muni code that talks about Muni code. I can get to it. About the zoning administrator and what is required for a zoning administration meeting, so that if the commissioners wanted to be a part of that meeting, they could be as public citizens. I'm looking at it right now.
What I want is I want there to be some accountability.
Mm-hmm.
And that's all. And so that it's not that I don't trust David Hannum himself. It's not him, it's the position.
No, I totally understand. I believe me, I totally understand.
And I was heading right where you were at. I was thinking, like, with the project status list, there'd be an equivalent list that these are all the projects that came up. They were in the HPO, and it was determined they didn't require any further review because they didn't have cultural significance, or it was just the windows. Dave's got, and that would be good. But to Dave's point, then, yeah, if we got this list and it was a couple weeks later, those windows are already in, or we don't want to hold up the guy that just wants to put in new windows and think it's not a historic, not affecting anything. But maybe all it is just a list that every month that says, hey, these are the projects that came up. They're in the HPO. They were deemed not to have any, cultural significance or anything, and it's just acknowledgement of what we didn't see, maybe. So in the future, we can always amend the language in the future to be on the lookout for other projects that maybe falling through cracks, maybe.
Well, yeah, I hear what you're saying, and if, but maybe Old Town Pinole is special enough that you have delays.
Yeah.
Because if we deem that is an important value of ours, then we say, well, then you live in here, you live in this district, be prepared to, it's going to take a little bit longer. I mean, I'm sure in other communities that's the case. I don't want to just have to shove things through, and we might even have discussions about what's an appropriate window. So I would push more towards it being delayed and there, but I don't know how to write that into the ordinance. And we may not agree on that. So.
No, put that into the ordinance. Frankly, what makes the most sense is to just say all design review for projects in the HPO goes to the planning commission, because then the planning commission, if that's your goal, certainly causes delays, but then it's clear, it's upfront, it's going to get scheduled at a planning commission meeting, and the planning commission can do the design review and can make the determination about the cultural resource and do the design review all at once, rather than, hey, let's say the planning commission, the zoning administrator makes a decision, and then it goes to the planning commission, and they kick it back to the planning commissioner now to say, yeah, you're wrong. It is a historic resource. Redo your design review. and it's like a back and forth. But that clearly, creates a delay and, additional staff work. But it seems like slightly less work to do it all at once at the Planning Commission than sort of a ping pong back and forth.
Yeah, maybe that's the way to go, because there is a value increase in being a historic building. At least I hope so. I think that goes with the territory. That if you're in a historic area, that you're.
Yeah, I'm agreeing with you.
Yeah. So Alex, your language, you're just saying that you're just going to include that every project shall in the historic overlay district shall be subject to Planning Commission design review. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and I think that would be a reason to, in the future, the Planning Commission sort of shrink the area of the overlay when they take this look to make sure that this isn't, a massive zone that's going to be projects that don't need to do that, but really a small zone. But I think, what I would say is this is certainly will cause delays in staff work. So I don't know, the city manager, for example, may when we present this to the city council may say, well, my recommendation is that this is just going to be a huge burden or a huge whatever. And so just so the commission knows that, that the city council obviously values the commission's the opinion. And so they want to hear this, but I just want to let there will probably be a recommendation, I would imagine, from the city manager or Tamara to just be like, this is going to be a huge burden on staff to do this extra level of review.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but the city council, that we have to remember our part in the process is that the city council is ultimate.
Yes, no, absolutely. I just didn't want the commission to think that, we said one thing at the Planning Commission meeting and then we went behind, changed the.
No, of course not, because it's, it's just a suggestion, but I'm not sure how much more. I guess the thing is the work in making the decision or the work in preparing the presentation, or to give to either the design review board of the Planning Commission or to the Planning Commission, right? So you do the work of actually making the decision or preparing it, right? So
right, and I don't, it may not be that much. I just want to, I think that wasn't a path we had thought about really, so then think about what that extra workload might be, and it. It may not be that, maybe there aren't that many projects a year that come through in this area.
Probably aren't.
Right.
No, they'll all come once they adopt the zone, then they'll all come.
Well, that's what I would, and Simon, I haven't heard you, speak to this yet, but I would prefer that we make some kind of suggestion like that to the city council, that there be more accountability instead of just one zoning administrator making that decision and there being no recourse after that.
And
so
I think we should be more in a suggestion. I'd say let's put in the language that Alex just suggested about and if the city council doesn't like that, they can then come up with what they want to come up with. I mean,
exactly.
And just the language that I'll make the change, and then it will be presented as an option to the city council. Right now, it says for a project proposed on a property located within the HPO zone, prior to the occurrence of any design review, the zoning administrator shall determine whether a project would result in change to a cultural resource on property. Well, I'll just change that to say, concurrent with design review, the Planning Commission shall determine blah, 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 shall determine whether the project will result in changes to a cultural resource on the property, administrative design review for projects within the HPO zone shall be conducted by the Planning Commission.
Okay, that sounds good. Remember that language because we're going to have to include it in the ordinance when we come. And I'm going to just refer to the Alex language.
Okay.
Okay.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much.
So I think we've done that. We've done the boundaries, the design, and then the additional properties are already covered. So we kind of have consensus with that. And I don't know if right now we need to make a recommendation on that before we look at the design review guidelines and bring up.
So what I would the recommendation would be that the Planning Commission recommend approval to the City Council of an ordinance adding Chapter 17.28 Historic Preservation Overlay to the Municipal Code with the change in language to Section 17.28.050.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, I believe that was motion by Commissioner Moriarty.
Yes.
Okay, and what about the boundaries? We've decided that we're just going to let the boundaries be as they are and suggest further review at a later time.
Actually, yeah, and we were going to add the to 17.28040 to add or subtract
Right.
from the HPO zone. That's what Simon had suggested.
Okay. Okay, got all that, Mr. Hannum?
Yep.
Okay, so that's the motion. Second?
I second that.
Okay, Adam seconds. Any discussion? I'll bring the matter to a vote. All in favor, say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Can we just do a quick roll call? Sorry, it's part of the the requirement for virtual things.
Okay, remote meetings. Okay, we'll do a roll call. Mr. Hannum?
All right, thank you. Commissioner Benzilli,
Aye.
Commissioner Wong,
Aye.
Commissioner Moriarty,
Aye.
Chair Current.
Aye.
Motion carries 4-0.
Okay, great. So now we go to the second part of this, which is to review the design guidelines.
Yeah. So, and Commissioner Flashman, you can
Come back.
come back, and so we don't have to rehash this because I believe Commissioner Flashman was probably listening. But these design guidelines were adopted in 1997, but haven't been applied in recent years. They're not mandatory by their terms. The goal is that they will be mandatory for projects in the HPO zone. So depending on, that's sort of up to the commission to decide, hey, we want to change the shoulds to shalls. Just to review right now, guidelines with the word should are intended to be applied as state lines, which I don't know exactly what that means. It's a confusing term. So in guidelines with the word encouraged are desired but not mandatory. Where it says discouraged, should be strictly adhered to, and guidelines using the word must are based on existing regulation that must be followed. So we, depending on what the commission wanted, we could clarify that should really means shall, should, which it appears was the intent of the original design guidelines, but it as I think some of the commissioners have pointed out, it's a little confusingly worded.
Well, we do define what the language means. I mean, that's. I think that's the key. As you pointed out, 3.1 does define the language.
Yeah.
So, let's look at that and see if we want to change that language. The language of that section or not.
Yeah.
So, just to repeat, guidelines which employ the word "should" are intended to be applied as stated. I mean, that's really a shall, right?
Yeah.
And guidelines using the word encourage are desirable but not mandatory. That's pretty clear.
Yeah.
Discourage should be, the word discourage should be strictly adhered to. Guidelines using the word must are based on existing regulation that must be followed. I'm just repeating it. I think it's pretty clear.
Well, okay, so let's look at an example, okay? An example just to see how we do it. And because I went through this, if we look at page 32 in the design guidelines, and by the way, David Hannum, did we find out if these are online now?
They are not online. They are just part of a staff report. So I'll be talking to Justin tomorrow. They should have been online last week. So
they should have been online, yeah, because we asked that last month.
Yeah, I know. So they will be on. They will be online somehow tomorrow.
Okay, great.
So we'll get that fixed.
So let's look at an example on page 32, number 3, right here. And what I was thinking of was the example is the Casa Amada, the artisanal garden.
Sure.
So if we were to see this, to read number 3, new development should respect existing structures in the immediate area through the use of similar materials and proportions and the avoidance of overwhelming scale and visual obstruction. So that when you read that, you read should is like, well, it's supposed to, even with the language on page 10. So it should respect. I don't know. It's not to me the same thing as it shall respect.
Yeah. So this would be part of code. I mean, can we use similar language that the building code uses as far as should, shall, must, those type of things? Because in the building code is fairly specific on what you're supposed to do. Use similar verbiage.
I like that idea because that's what I've been doing, right? So I think that is a clear definition of from the building code of what those are meaning to. But again, I'm just concerning about again this Old Town Design Review Guideline. When we put it in, well, I guess we will truly apply to the entire zone, and we know that the zone can change, right? And so if we are saying a must, for example, or a shall must, example, are we creating some sort of difficulties for applicant? If that particular building, it's not really, it's in the zone, but not, I mean, it's not significant enough. I'm just raising the questions here.
Yeah.
But I think the language provides for that. So should incorporate representative character of the surrounding area. That doesn't necessarily mean the entire historic overlay. That means that specific area. So if it's part of, a different area, not, right next to the Old Bank of Pinole, for example, then it can just be similar to the place next to it versus has to be similar to the Bank of Pinole. Does that make sense?
That absolutely makes sense, and that's triggered the original discussions, Alex, that you point out that some subcommittee member was talking about, should we change that review design guideline to not saying Old Town, right? Because then that you can apply to anywhere. I agree with Sarah that now you can apply it to anywhere. Shall that zone be larger or smaller?
I think it also depends on how you read it. So this specific one says the characteristics of the surrounding area. I don't know. It doesn't specific. It'd be different if it said the characteristics of Old Town.
Okay, well, I guess the idea of making the language consistent with building codes it was a suggestion. Could either Simon or Adam elaborate on what the building codes language they use? Do they use should, shalls, maybes?
It's been a while since I've actually read it, but I remember it does specifically say, you shall do this, and there's certain things you can and can't do, and it's very clear, right? It's not subjective.
For the good of through the chair for the commission, the building code defines should to mean recommend, and shall to mean shall denotes a mandatory specification or requirement.
I think another good example is just on the same page, site character number 2. Structures which are historic or are otherwise distinctive should be preserved and incorporated into development proposals. That sounds very different with a shall versus should. Kind of sounds like a recommendation. I think it would make sense to change all of the shoulds to shalls. Can't say that word. Because that's what is implied, or that's what the goal was of the.
Yeah.
And then we could go through and kind of, I don't know, we want to go through all of the shoulds and be like, oh, should this one be a shall, or should it be a recommended? I don't know if we want to do that. But
yeah. I mean, I can also argue here on page 21 that particular guideline is kind of specifically talking about a storefront. Then if we all change it to shall, then well, I mean, again, not every single building has a storefront. So how are we going to deal with that?
Well,
I differentiate with commercial and residential, though. I mean, isn't that in the commercial section?
Exactly. So I guess, is that a general language on top of this guideline saying that, certain items only could apply to a certain types of building or whatnot?
Well, I think that is the guidelines themselves provide for that.
Yeah.
But I think if the commission wanted, the course of action would be perhaps to make change 3.1 to just say, every reference to should shall be interpreted as shall mean, now I'm stuck on that, but the use of should in this in these guidelines is mandatory and has the same definition as the word shall, and perhaps that's a little clearer than what's in 3.1 now.
Yeah, I kind of like what you're saying, Alex. I think it should either be shall or say that this is what's intended. That's the intention. Because like design guidelines, when you really dig into them, give a fair amount of subjectivity to the actual individual design guideline. It doesn't say, every building has to have a storefront. It's like, hey, if you have a storefront, this is generally how we want to do it. So there's flexibility within the guidelines, but I think there's things that are should be shalls, because those are the things that are important to us.
Yeah. So, for example, 3.1 right now says guidelines which employ the word should are intended to be applied as stated. We changed that to say guidelines which employ the word should are intended to be mandatory.
That's because, I'm sorry.
I think that is maybe just a little clearer to say as mandatory rather than as stated, or guidelines which employ the word should are mandatory.
Sure, that makes sense. That's the place to change it.
I'm still struggle with my example of Dr. Lee buildings here. And again, yes, I know that we just basically say that the map can change, right? You can subtract that building.
Well, Dr.
Took a
Lee,
while. He can always come back and within a year or two applying for an addition to the building that is attached to that current building. And because we approve that this is a full guideline, then going back to you, Adams, his building is going to be commercial. And none of those are going to be applied to his building because of the design. So what are we going to do? Are we then delay his process by going back to the city council of changing the map? Are there any particular language that have given authority for the design manager or whoever that can opt out for that building because of its specific design or the look and feel of the building itself?
So the design guidelines are I guess maybe it's a good example. Like you'd only be applying it to the addition, and I don't know if there's specific things in here, but like I'm not sure whether.
Yeah, I mean, Simon, I hear what you're saying, and I think for that instance, you wouldn't make Dr. Lee then put a storefront into that section of the building, because now we say, hey, you shall have a storefront, and a specific all the stuff that goes on with the storefront. Your also says you wouldn't want to clash with other things, so you wouldn't want to enforce something that now has to be done that clash with the existing building that's already there. You'd have to do there's going to be some sensibility about what gets applied, I guess, so that it doesn't clash with the rest of the building.
I'm thinking, like, for example, let's just say that if my example did happen, okay, I'm thinking about the process. Okay, so maybe the first step is that David will have to submit this particular request, whether or not they are starting the design or whatnot, to the planning commission. Say, hey, there's a desire to put an additional chunk of buildings to Dr. Lee's design, for example, okay? And then maybe there's a language or somewhere that we can have the planning commission will have a discretions of approve, I'm just thinking out loud, the design not to follow the certain guideline. You see what I mean? Because otherwise you're going to waste the applicant time of going through the guideline and end up like that is not going to match its intention, I think.
Well, Simon, the guidelines actually address that. I mean, if you look at your specific example on page 42, it talks about additions and contemporary design for alterations and additions to existing properties should not be discouraged when such alterations and additions do not destroy significant historical, architectural, or cultural material. So I think that's where that discretion is. I mean, what do you apply to it? I mean, you're not going to tell them to build something that looks like the old bank building attached to it. So I think there's a lot of reasonableness and, as was said before, flexibility in these guidelines that would help in that design review. So I don't think it's pushing it too hard.
Well, and the other thing we have to decide is if it's a historic structure. I mean, most of these guidelines talk about historic structures. The new construction, I mean, that ship left the dock in a sense, because it got approved, and to go back and get it now, if they were to add an addition, would be a little bit and use that addition to it wouldn't make sense. So I mean, page 42 makes a pretty good point. If it's a contemporary design, and it's consistent with the design it has, and it's not something wild at that point, You know, we can also, the other thing is too, is that, you know, that besides the actual structure of the building, color can also come into play in this too as well. So there might be some ideas where we might be able to say, you know, where we're not necessarily going to change the design of the building. However, you know what? If we change the color of it, it could accent some of the buildings better in a different way. So there are ways to distinguish, and there are other ways to bring a building to match an area. Especially with these contemporary buildings that are, I mean, because basically all the shopping center are contemporary buildings. They're not historic buildings. They don't match any historic renderings that have been in Old Town Pinole. The coloring is some of the colors are, in a sense, and that's something how you would attack those newer buildings, is that more into a color to create a theme within the downtown. And that's kind of what, you know, I mean, it's been my experience when we're doing old towns and we're doing design guidelines and we're doing those types of things, is that you're looking for a theme. And if that theme can be met by colors and be matched by colors, and you can bring an area like together. So where you might not be able to change the actual building type, you might be able to get them on the other side of it and say, well, yeah, but you are required to use, you know, gunmetal gray and, you know, forest green, because that's within the Old Town guidelines, and you can bring it in that way as well. So there are other ways to, you know, apply these guidelines in a sense, depending on what the building is, and when we talk about flexibility, we'll need that flexibility because there are buildings within the historic district that were built in the 60s and 70s and 80s.
Right.
So we're going to need some flexibility. So I've always tried, if I can't make a building, you know, comply with, you know, the actual, you know, it's got to be bricks and it's got to have awnings or that type of stuff, I try to bring it all in with color, because sometimes color, and then you can see a theme when you come into that area. So that's another option that is available, and it's available through the guidelines as well. So I mean, that's kind of how, like when we did an Angels Camp, you know, we had in our downtown, of course, you had the 1860 buildings, and then you had the 1920 buildings and the 1945 buildings, but they all were under the same color scheme. So, you know, you still could match them that way. And then they followed their through the Department of Interior guidelines and all that. They were required to follow their own style. So the Art Deco hotel that's in downtown, anything that to be added onto that would be an Art Deco side. Or with the buildings across the street where they're built in the 1840s, then we have to have, you know, build it similar to that. So there's other ways on how to kind of attach these, and that's what these guidelines allow us to do. So to kind of get to match those buildings to the theme or to the time frame that they are. Hopefully that added a bunch of confusion to everything too.
No, actually, I think it clarified. So it means that everything that is built now remains integral to itself.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's taken into context with everything that's around it. So even like with the gateway stuff, that would all look like the gateway stuff. It wouldn't look like something different. It would be cohesive with what's there currently.
Which doesn't now, but.
Well, no, but what we can do, if there was an addition, if there was an addition of a certain amount, then we can come back and say, hey, based on the Old Town guidelines that are now in effect, you know, here's the color scheme that you're going to have to match to bring it all into play. So
it's got to be mint green.
Well, whatever. So depending on what. And I don't know. I don't think they're. I don't know if the city adopted a color scheme in the guidelines or not. But I mean, in most cases,
no.
Most paint lines have a historical palette that you can draw from. I know in Angels Camp we adopted the Sherman. I think it was Sherman Williams or Bear. They'd had a multitude of colors that quote consider were historic in nature.
Yeah.
So
I don't think we have that because otherwise I would have pushing up all the pink color. I'm just joking.
I think he just talks about like no
Famous on that.
pastels and no neons and
Yeah.
things to avoid, but not necessarily a color palette.
So can we make an agreement on that language change then? Getting back to what originally started us on this path?
Absolutely.
That every reference to shall be interpreted as mandatory.
Yeah, and I think as long as that change of language is still providing the flexibility on that particular front, and I personally am fine with it.
Okay.
Okay.
I just have one quick question on it. So when we make this mandatory, is there a supersedence as far as if we say something like, hey, you got to have X percentage of windows, or this, that, and the other, and it potentially contradicts what Title 24 and Energy Calc may say? Is there a supersedence that the California Title 24 would still supersede this if there was some sort of conflict?
well, we would have to go probably to the historic building codes at that point. So which would allow us to. Would probably not have to check with Alex on that one, but the historic building codes would probably allow us to not have to do those major code changes in terms of the. But that's something that we'd have to look at.
Okay.
Okay. So want to change that language to mandatory? That consensus?
Yeah. So.
Okay. What else do we need to discuss about this? Anything else in the document that needs to be addressed?
I have a number of comments. We're getting into specific language on the specific design guidelines.
Sure. So we're here.
Page 14 under section A.3, which has a maximum building height of 3 stories at 40 feet may be permitted if the third story volume is enclosed by a pitched roof. It seems like 3 stories is actually fairly, that ended up being almost, 40, 50 feet tall. That's a fairly tall building. Should we say something like where, that height of a building is not really allowed or it's discouraged from going that vertical?
Well, we already said that the maximum building height should be 2 stories and 35 feet. And then we offer an exclusion saying a maximum building height of 3 stories and 40 feet may be remitted if this third story volume is enclosed by a pitched roof. So we pretty much do set the limit and just saying this is an exception. If you can, you can
make the architecture work.
It's
still fairly tall. It's still a fairly tall building. In contrast to everything else that's around there.
I leave that to the architects of the group to, because height is a problem I have a real hard concept with.
Literally 40 feet is like 1.5 single-story house nowadays with a pitched roof. Like I'm looking at my house for example. I think I'm hitting about like 20 feet, 18 feet actually. So it's literally like 3-story with a pitched roof, hitting about like 36 feet. So 40 feet is actually not too bad. Consider that a lot of the old town structure has, especially go closer to the central area of the old town, the buildings are taller. I do have the similar concern as again, going back to the map itself, right? What if someone is going to build something right next to across the road of Green Lantern and doing a little tiny skinny building with 3-story high with pitch roof, But then I think, if that's ever going to submit to us, we can always look into it from a design standpoint, whether or not we agree.
Well, note that number 3, at the end of it says, note a variance may be needed to be obtained to allow a building to be more than 2 stories or 35 feet high.
Yeah, there are a couple different zoning districts within this old town, but typical zoning district has a height limit of 35 feet. There are a couple that have more than that.
Well, the specific plan has Old Town at 40 feet or 3 stories, but there's a special height requirement. So after the second story, I think it has to be cascaded, or it has to be set back. Special height requirement. Yeah, it has to like be set back like 45 degrees, or so it has like a quote a vision triangle. I'm looking right now. Yeah, that's what we should.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I've read, so far, again, is with the specific plan, anything going to 3. I mean, we have a lot of those examples at the really closing to the St. Pablo, at the tenant area, where they do the stepping, or they do a very high pitch roof. That's kind of representing back into the Victorian style house. And I don't think that it's going to be a issue again, but again, the Old Town. I mean, one of the things that Sarah, you point out, on the other section is to try to be considerate, right? To your surrounding. And I think that is our freedom to say, even though you can do this, but
right. Okay, that's fair point.
Matching, yeah.
Okay, that's fair point. On page 15, item 4, the blank walls visible from a public place may be allowed if the wall is treated architecturally with some sort of graphic. I think that should be discouraged. I mean, or at least we go through an extensive design review for what the architectural treatment is, or if there's some sort of planned wall graphic.
My husband would agree with you. Totally.
Actually, same here. I don't like blank walls. I don't like graphics. So, no, I think that is something that we need to somehow change it or eliminate it.
Yeah, it's like, I think it says blank walls or it should not face public trees, or maybe it's must not or shall not. Like I said, it will be now, shall not.
Yeah.
Page 16, section C.2. New building should contain 3 parts: a base, a midsection, and a top. It's more of a discussion thing, but is that limiting to a particular style of building? Maybe that should be an encourager to have that kind of articulation in the design, but not necessarily becoming a shall that maybe limits, the architecture, or it sets us to a certain time.
I think that's a good point, Adam. I think that it's hard to define what the rhythm of the surrounding building, that's kind of a nebulous thing. So I think it makes sense to say encouraged.
Good. What item is that? Sorry.
On page 16.
16.
C.2.
Where it says new building should contain 3 parts: a base, a midsection, and a top.
Got it.
Okay, on the difference parts. For figure 8. Okay.
I mean, I think it should, the architecture should match whatever's going on, consistent with the rest of the area, not necessarily of a specific style.
Let's say, for example, okay, let's say I'm gonna take an example of Antlers. You and I know this one property. It's a pretty big building, right? Oh no, that's not a good. Let me pull up a building. 3-story. We don't have a 3-story building here.
What about the old bank building? Is that 3 stories?
It's it's 2 stories. It has 2 stories in the back. Yeah, it kind of rises up in the back. It's all under one roof. But if we build it, let's say the next building wants to go a story taller, then we would take a look at the bank next to the bank and maybe one of these two styles would fit that, where they kind of stair step it up and show the top, the middle. That would be similar to the bank.
Yeah, and again, that can be resolved by saying that, again, going back to what Sarah you point out, hey, you need to look at matching or corresponding to the building next to you. So even if we don't restrict this, even if we take this out and we would change the word, should, to encourage, right?
Mm-hmm.
They have the flexibility of designing something, and we always have the enforcement to say, nah, match the bank.
Yeah. Yeah, I kind of think that word should be changed to encourage too.
Yeah.
Okay.
What does everybody think?
We're looking at page 16, C2. That new buildings are encouraged to contain 3 parts. Is that?
Yes, that is what we're.
Okay.
And I think that makes sense. I think it makes more sense for it to match the surrounding area than to go to this specific guideline.
Yeah, I think that is a golden key, right? If we don't, unless we have a style that we all agree on or city council like it, to encourage the architect to be able to be able to not restrict them, but allow them to make something happen, but still have that kind of guideline of matching, right? I think that would be good enough.
Then how did we end up with Dr. Lee's building? Wow.
Good questions.
Ugh.
Oh, that's a different discussion, but I don't think it's what we intended, to be quite honest with you, but that's a different discussion.
Yeah.
Yeah. It is. Go ahead, Alex or Adam. You're on a roll here. What's next?
Page 19, items 4 and 5 under building materials. It's a list of appropriate building materials, including stone, stucco, brick, etc., and inappropriate building materials, including siding, aluminum, curtain, reflective glass, etc. Not that I'm necessarily agreeing that any of the inappropriate ones should be moved to the appropriate list, or vice versa. But I just want to make sure that list is that updated, or is that current to what we currently kind of have in these areas? I mean, if we're trying to maintain some consistency, but then we tell someone, hey, you can't put vertical wood siding, and it's a should or a shall, should those be back to encourage, or should the list kind of not be there? And it says, it should be consistent with the area.
A lot of consistent with the area, but like if you have on any of the houses, at least in this Old Town specific area, if you put vertical siding on them, which some have because it wasn't ever enforced, it detracts totally from the neighborhood. I guess the thing we need to think of these as being guidelines for the architect, for the designer, and things like that, and certain things. And this is where the problem becomes when we extend the Old Town guidelines to, because these are specific. These are specific.
Well, remember, the whole gist of the historic preservation was, Old Town really was the center of all of this. That's where it was in 1997. That's where it was in 2010 when they developed the specific plan. The Old Town be Old Town, and these guidelines actually went farther than anything else, because they defined what Old Town was. And can we use this on the other side? If we include a house, or if we include somebody, then they're going to have to be abided by the guidelines. But this is really mainly these guidelines are for Old Town.
Yes.
So there's no question about that.
Can we add a language here on this particular page, or maybe even for the page 18 on item F, that's specifically, again, if we are going to change the guideline names to something else other than Old Town, we can always come back to this item F and say materials and color specific for the Old Town, area.
Right.
Then this material will apply to that area only. Right? I mean, can that be done that way?
I like that.
That works for me.
Yeah.
Okay, wait, repeat that again.
So let's just say that if we change this guideline from Old Town Design Review guideline to something else,
Right.
because we know that there will be some expansion of the HPO zone. Going back to this page of 18, item F, materials and color, we specifically spelled out material colors for the Old Town area only.
Okay, so anywhere else within the historic overlay district that's not within Old Town is going to have something different?
Yeah, I mean, that will be then these questions of the creativity of an architect or whoever designing it, and it will still go through the planning commissions to look at the design.
Okay, so that I always like to play the devil's advocate as staff. So I'm a developer. I've got a building. I'm just outside of Old Town. What we determine is Old Town, and I come to you guys with this great, nice building. For example, I don't know where, but I come. It's modern style building. If you're going to say with these guidelines that these materials and colors and all the other stuff is only good for Old Town, then you're not going to hold me accountable. Then then you can't hold me accountable for those guidelines, for those specific guidelines, because I'm not within the Old Town area.
I know, but you are still under the HPO zone, so you are still sticking with our idea of you need to somehow match your surrounding. So if you decided that, you know what, Old Town don't like pink, and you decided to trick me as a commissioner to put the entire building pink, I would say, well, your next door building is not pink, so don't use pink. I mean, can that be an argument? I get throwing out the ideas here.
What do you think, Alex?
I guess I'm a little. So, if something is within the HPO zone, but not in Old Town, I mean, we don't have a definition for what. Like in the future, we'd have to add a definition for what is Old Town.
Well, that's where I was kind of going. I mean, we'd have to basically create another set or some type of guideline for those areas that are outside of Old Town if we were going to differentiate Old Town and historic.
I am, on the other hand, saying that, changing the name of this design guideline so that it can always overlap the HPO zone only specifically calls some of the sections related to a certain area. Like in this case, we talk about the material and colors, okay?
Right.
And yes, that means that what additional work that we need to do is to create a map that is really, truly fine-grained related to the Old Town area, right? So in this case, this material and color will only to go to that new map, but the rest of it still apply to the overall HPO zone. I mean, your way is also a good way too. Like we have to kind of start thinking about all the other, maybe creating another design guideline too. But I'm just thinking about like what is the alternate.
Well, my opinion on that is that if we make it specific, the developer can always say, "Oh, apply for a variance too." So we're not saying they can't. It's just that we're kind of implying that they should. I silenced everybody.
Not to kick the can down the road, but this could also be something that if and when, that gets looked at if and when there's an expansion of the HPO zone, outside of Old Town at some point in the future. It doesn't have to be addressed right now, when right now it's only Old Town properties.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
I'm all right kicking the can.
Same here.
So what's the consensus?
If I'm reading it correctly through the chair, I think the consensus is keep the language on this material and color list as is, and then kick the can later on when we expand the XPO zone and talk about what items on this particular design review guideline can apply to those zones.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
All right, Adam, what's next?
Last one. Page 25, it's section 4.4A7. The use of native and drought-resistant plants, shrubs, and trees is encouraged. Given our current California water situation, I think one of that should be shall.
Yep.
So they are only using native and drought-resistant plants.
Yeah, that
landscaping
has
plan.
to. Yeah, 'cause that's one of those superseded things because we already have the drought landscaping language there. Mhm.
Cool. That's it.
Which page is that on?
Page 25, section 4.4A.7.
Oh, okay.
And that was it. Thanks.
Okay. Anything else? Anybody else suggesting any changes? Okay.
Sarah, do you have anything else that you? I have some things, but
Go for it.
I don't want to. Okay. Okay. Yeah. I guess they're more just comments. Things like the reason that I'd really like to see this happen quickly is because of what has happened with the optometrist building. I'm looking at page 14, letter B, building orientation, how buildings should be oriented. And I think following this throughout here, we've ended up with a building that's got its electrical box right on Pinole Valley Road and not hidden by trees that we had already discussed not being appropriate for it, et cetera, et cetera. And so if we had had these guidelines in place, we would have been able to say, no, absolutely not. So anyway, so that's one. And again, on page 24, the same thing. Existing mature trees, creeks, and riparian corridors should be preserved and incorporated into landscape plans. There's another example that, we didn't even think about there. And so I guess I'm actually not adding to the conversation very much. Vertical. So actually, going to page 37 with the accessory building design, we addressed that when we were talking about accessory buildings versus ADUs.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. And rehab, rehabilitation guidelines. Actually, I think that is pretty much it. Right. And I guess my question is we can't go backwards, right? We can't go to Casa Amada and say, you've got to change your signage so that it matches stuff. We can't do that, right?
Nope.
So it's just going forward. So let's get
Yeah.
these in.
So they change the design, then we can act. So we just
Right.
hoping that, you know, they don't like the design and they will come back to us.
Okay.
Okay, so we've made all of our changes. I hope somebody was writing all this stuff down. Where is the action that we're looking for here? I thought, do we?
So Dave, I think if you go to the one more slide, it would just be that for the Plan Commission to recommend the City Council adopt the design review guidelines with the stated changes.
Okay, and part of that is, do we agree on the changing it to Old Town and Historic Design Guidelines?
Is that part of the past discussion or part of this discussion?
It's part of this discussion.
Perfect, thank you. I personally think that it should include Old Town, and it should include that language of Old Town because a lot of this is very specific to Old Town. And I think that was the intent of it, or the original intent. But I also like the idea that it could be applied to other places outside of Old Town. Parts of it, I think the tricky thing is kind of what we keep coming up against is, if someone lives way outside of Old Town and ends up being president, like you guys said, clearly we're not going to say like, oh, now it has to be an old Victorian house, or it has to have this type of siding, or if you added, and I don't know if there's a way that we could add a certain portion. I mean, I guess the biggest thing is that there's a focus on matching what's around it rather than matching Old Town. So with that and with that in mind, then I think it makes sense to include both.
I mean, following our discussions, if we are going to plan of kicking the can until we discuss about, like other areas, not in the current, Old Town XPO zone area anyway, then perhaps we can leave that name as is, and knowing for the fact that eventually we have to come back and talk about some other guidelines. Or maybe then we can think about changing the names. But for now, I think, if the area, it's going to be the same, and our starting point is still the Old Town area, then I don't think there's a need to change it.
Okay. All right, so we don't change the name. And so those are the two recommendations that are up for grabs. Or recommendation 2. Any more discussion? Motion, second?
I think that's, we just had that every reference to should will be interpreted as mandatory.
Yeah, well, you could just say that staff recommends that the Planning Commission, would do that with the following modifications, which include something that I hope David or Alex was writing down, all the changes that we recommended.
Right, could we just have a summary of all of our little changes? Just the little check.
Okay. First change is on 3.1. That was changed. And then all of you were on consensus with Adam's changes.
Mm-hmm.
So that was on page, first one was on page 15. blank walls on number 4. Blank walls shall not on that one. On page 16 under C2, new buildings are encouraged.
Yep.
On page should be shall, number 7 on number 25. The use of native and drought plants shall be, or shrubs and trees, well, we'll put, we'll fix that, but it should be a shall, not encouraged. Number 50 on 25, and then that's all I had, unless there was something else. There were comments about 37, but we didn't make any changes to them.
Mhm.
Am I right?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Then I think I've got all the changes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Excellent. Okay, great. Thank you.
So do we have a motion?
Go ahead, Sarah.
I move to approve the Old Town Design Guidelines as edited, as listed by planner David Hannum. Does that sound right?
Yes.
Okay.
Second.
Oh, wait, before we vote, and we'll take a roll call vote, right, Alex?
Yes.
Are we changing the title?
No.
No.
Okay, all right, just a second. Okay, so with that, I have a motion and a second. So I'll take roll at this point. Commissioner Benzuli,
Aye.
Commissioner Moriarty,
Aye.
Commissioner Wong,
Aye.
Vice Chair Flashman,
Aye.
Chair Current.
Aye.
Motion carries 5-0.
Okay. And what about number 2? Do we do?
That we already, that was the previous recommendation.
That's what I thought. Okay. Well, with that, I would like to remind the public, if I can find the wording that, where's that stupid wording?
Through the chair, it's okay to not read the appeal reading because this was just a recommendation to the city council, so it will be going to the council automatically.
Good, then I would be going all over the place looking for that stuff. Okay, so that closes the public hearing. And we move on to the next agenda item, which is we have nothing for old business, and G, new business, housing law review. So
Chair and commissioners, our plan was to hold this over till the next meeting when the 2 new commissioners are joined too, so they can get the benefit of it.
Good idea. All right, do we have to make a vote on that?
No, it's not a hearing. So, I mean, if that's the will of the commission, we can.
Sure.
That's fine by me.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, we'll hold it over. And H is going to be City Planners Commissioners Report. And number 1 on that is the verbal updates of projects.
Yeah, you had the list I had last time, which I don't, for some reason I can't put my hands on. However, we did take in 2 new. Well, we took in another affordable housing project at 811 San Pablo. So 33 units, and so we're using some density bonus on that property. That's one of the old city properties for redevelopment. And so we're in contract with a developer, and so we'll be moving that forward through the process as well. We're continuing to work with the property owner at 2801 Pinole Valley Road. We sent them a notice of completeness letter to to make improvements to his plans, and so we're working with him on that. Because I know you have questions, but there have been updates with the eye doctor's building. Yeah, I wasn't too happy about all of those Italian cypresses right along the frontage. We worked with him to grab another couple of native trees that they'll be replanting. They'll be moving some of those Italian cypresses to other parts of the property, and that will bring a lot more color, a lot more broader canopy, so to speak. So it would kind of block a little more, but at least highlight with the colorful trees. So I'm working with him on that. And just to let you know, the building's not close. It's not even close to being final at this point. It will not be final until I'm satisfied with what they've done in terms of the landscaping. So,
Yeah.
I'm working with them on that.
Yeah, because the whole approval of that project was based on the fact that the landscaping was going to be the architecture and not just a big white building. You know, it's not coming out that way.
So I'm working with what got approved as the landscape plan, and I'm twisting some arms, and I'm working with Dr. Lee. He's been very cordial to work with. And he's answered a lot of my questions of what I'd like to see, and so we've got a good working relationship at this point. So we're moving forward on that.
A question, David. Will that electrical box be blocked as well with some landscaping shrubbery?
Yeah, there'll be some shrub. There'll be some taller shrubs that will block some of that. There will be. I think one of the trees or one of the new trees that we're proposing will, as it grows, the canopy will block that. Will block that box. So yeah, there's landscaping to cover some of that stuff up.
Will the cypress, the Italian cypresses, will any of them stay, or will all of them be gone?
No, a couple of them will stay. We're going to mix some trees in between just to kind of because they were on, and I don't have it in front of me right now, but I've been trying to, because there was a landscape plan that was approved, and so I'm working with the approved landscape plan and what's being proposed at this point. Okay, so I mean, he could tell me, you know what, I'm planning it the way I want to plan it, and that's it. And I really don't have a lot to say about it, because that project was approved, 3 years ago? So we are trying to work with him. Is it going to be a perfect fit? I'm going to tell you right now, it probably won't be 100% to your liking of what you have, what you want, but I'm trying to get as much in there as I can to offset some of that. Okay, so I don't know if I'll be able to move all the Italian cypress trees. I probably will be able to get 2 or 3 of them out of there, which will do a lot of that. I mean, once the other trees come in and they bloom and they do that, it will change that look in terms of the area. But the trees will have to grow. I mean, there'll be 15-gallon trees. And so, yeah, so I'm working on that. Okay. But like I said, am I going to get 100%? I don't know. And I don't know when that matter, when he decides to push back. I haven't gotten there yet, which is because I think we've got a good working relationship. And so I'm just trying to keep that good working relationship and move some stuff. He's been very, like I said, with this, he's been very easy to work with. So, we're just going with that.
Well, I think the key with Dr. Lee is that this is his. He wants this to be his life work. You know, I think when he was going through the process, he was talking about how he'd like to have this done while his mother's alive and all that. I think he wants to have something that he's proud of.
Well, yeah, I mean, and you know, we can't answer for what happened 3 years ago in terms of the approval process, because I don't think the only one who was there is probably Dave at this point. Maybe Simon. I don't know. I mean, but yeah, I mean, it's a whole new commission compared to where it was 3 years ago, and that's sometimes what happens, you'll approve a project and 3 years later or 6 years later, someone will come in before they build it. Oh, what was that planning commission thinking? We need to change all that. We need to add this and subtract that and do all this and do that. And we have and I have no authority really to do that.
But
Yeah.
You've got an approved project.
the plan was for those trees to stay, and the fact is that those trees got taken out.
Well, there was
The reason that because I was there, I wasn't on the commission, but I went to the final approval meeting, and one of the reasons why the plan was approved was because those trees that got taken out were going to stay there. That was a huge contention.
Right. Yeah,
And so now the landscape plan that's been implemented is nothing like what was approved.
I agree, and if you remember, Sarah, I don't know if you remember, I actually was the one who actually opposed that building new design so much. Not until they are coming and say, okay, we will do something, on the landscape plan to make sure that majority of the fund is being covered by landscape. Otherwise, I'm going to stick to my point and saying no to it. I think I'm the one who is like kind of in the middle of it, and like that's what I recall. So the current plan is not really close to what I think I remember.
No, and I can tell you, since I approved the tree removal permits, if you looked at those trees and what those trees were going to do to the footprint of his building and to the utility boxes, that are in that area, it would be all destroyed.
Right, but then David, it should have come back to us.
Yeah, it could have. Yeah,
to approve a new landscape plan, that should have come back to us. To change, this is a center thing that is in Pinole. This is something that I drive by every day.
Right.
And it's something that a lot of people in Pinole drive by every day, and it's not what the Planning Commission approved.
Right.
So then it should have come back to us to approve a new landscaping plan if the original landscaping plan wasn't going to work. And so the cypresses, they don't match.
No.
We just spent an entire meeting talking about making sure that our community is cohesive.
Right.
And is a place that is welcoming and where we want to be, and has that old town feel. That building in and of itself, it is what it is. I understand that.
Right.
But then the landscape is the thing that was going to save it, and make it so that it was Pinole. And now that's been taken, and been taken in a way that isn't, that wasn't what the Planning Commission wanted, and wasn't what, as appointed by the City Council, not what the people of Pinole want. So I think there needs to be a change in terms of either the process of how this happens. If there's a significant change in a landscaping plan, that should probably come before the Planning Commission again, even if it has to change. But then that means something else needs to change. So if those trees weren't going to be there, then maybe that building couldn't have been there.
Well, I don't, and I'll defer to Alex on this. So if you've approved a building in the spot of the building and they change the landscape plan, I don't know how much authority you would have to take to reopen the whole entire project. So just know that in terms of, it wouldn't necessarily would give you another shot at the apple, at least for the whole building and the whole package.
Yeah.
But
what I'm getting at is this landscaping plan is what made or break this building, and how it looks right now. I drive past it every day and I'm angry.
Yeah, I drive by it every day as well. I drive it to and from, and that was not the cypress trees were not what we talked about, and so that's why why they even got planted in the first place. They should have never been planted, so they're probably going to have to all be uprooted, because that's not what we talked about. So we talked about some other more native trees in the area, to provide more of a color scheme across it, and that wasn't. No, I'm working on that. So just to let you know that I'm not I'm going to try and get all those Italian cypresses pulled out of there and put somewhere else. So that's the goal.
I appreciate that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Let me see. In terms of other projects, bigger projects, we're still waiting for an application probably in the next 2 weeks for the old hospital property. There's a developer that's looking to build some multifamily project on that parcel, or those 2 parcels of the old hospital. We're working on that, we'll hopefully be getting that. And of course, Pinole Vista is still out there. Pinole Vista is out there. We haven't really heard a whole lot from them lately. That we were supposed to expect something in early to mid-February, but we haven't seen anything yet. However, Pinole Woods, which is on San Pablo, they're getting ready to submit their application. We met with their people, and that's about another 170 units that we're looking at, that we're hoping to get that application here in the next 2 to 3 weeks. So we sent them there. It's like the draft conditions of approval that we usually use. We've been in contact with them about a couple of things, so we go forward on that. So when they submit on that.
Okay, and the citizens be heard. They brought up the issue with the Sprouts a park. About the trail, I guess it was.
As far as I know about what's going on over there, I'm not quite sure. I know that we have been going after the owners of Sprouts of the shopping center to fix that. I'm not sure where that's at.
Okay.
Public Works has been handling that side of it, so I haven't really seen much of that yet.
Maybe you can have an update for next month's meeting.
Yeah, I will. I did want to make a comment. Mr. Rafael Menes made a comment on G1 on the housing law review, which basically his comment was, greeting commissioners, staff, and public. Given the limitations discussed in this item on subjective guidelines by SB 35, slide 12, page 91, what impact will that have on the Old Town design guidelines the commission has just recommended that the council adopt as part of the historic preservation overlay? Given that they are mostly subjective by that standard. It is unlikely that 10+ family developments will be planned for the Old Town area anytime in the near future, but with the potential for expansion of the overlay, I think it should be considered.
Okay.
So we'll take that up. I'll print that out. We'll put it in the minutes for tonight's meeting, and we'll have it for we'll have it in the we'll be able to talk about it at the next meeting.
Okay.
So the last thing about Sprouts, as our last meeting, you were going to speak with the city engineer on the update of the trees that were to be planted along the creek and what mitigation was, or I guess it's not even mitigation anymore, but what was going on as far as making sure that there was more vegetation planted in the city that had been promised.
That I still have to talk to her with that. I was going to talk to her about both items. I haven't been able to do that.
Okay.
I will have something for you at the next meeting on that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Anything else that you have for any questions of staff you have right now?
Any comments by the commissioners? Just speak out if you have anything.
No, I appreciate the work that staff does and how we do this. But I agree with Commissioner Flashman and Commissioner Wong, who shared just a deep disappointment with the process that has landed us with a building that perhaps the owner is proud of and considers it his life work, but does not at all match what is there. So I don't know if we need to revisit how the process happens, how legally we have any recourse or anything like that. But I just wanted to echo that disappointment and just discouragement with the process. That means that what a planning commission had chosen and voted for was in the end disregarded, and not necessarily by staff, but by the developer and by how that worked out. So
Yeah. Okay, anybody else have anything they would like to say or add or question? If not, we have no, I'll go on to the next agenda, communications. We have none. And the next meeting is going to be March 22nd at 7 p.m. So I will adjourn this meeting and see you next March.
great, thanks.
Thanks.